Chapter 1, Admission. The path grew tighter, the jagged edges of the walls rewarded with the taste of his flesh on numerous occasions, yet he continued to surge forward, guiding them through the dimly lit passage as quickly as he dared. His side ached, the feel of the blade slicing across his body lingering far longer than he liked, but he couldn't stop. His mind reeled, trapping memories of where he was going with the danger of where he was coming from, and he felt the familiar breath of panic hot against the back of his neck. Over and over, the rocky formations jutted out, forcing him to yell in a strangled whisper to alter their course, yet never once did he consider breaking their stride. He looked ahead, his eyes swimming through the darkness to catch Kai's figure darting in and out of the shadows, and felt the slightest hint of apprehension lift from his heart. She stumbled multiple times, her balance displaced to the point she slammed into the walls with little to cushion the impact or shield her flesh from being torn into tatters, yet she gathered her senses, pushed past her pain, and raced ahead again, refusing to yield to memories capable of rendering a lesser person unable to move. "There's a left turn ahead, then keep straight," his voice sounded, in a garbled hush. She did as he said, making the tight left turn appearing only as a dark cavern in the heart of the shadows, and made her way into the chute without hesitation. The light vanished entirely, the ability to see snuffed out in an instant, yet she pressed on without fail, until the world felt as though it had disappeared, her life forfeit, and her soul was lost unto purgatory. Her mind wandered, seeking solace from the gnawing fear within the pit of her stomach, yet finding only the festering remnant of her horrid ordeal. She wondered if she was still bleeding. The pain was there, sharp and lasting, but she didn't dare to touch it for fear it would leave her crippled and hamper their escape. She could still see his face, Ephron, see him smiling as he took her by the hand, led her into the shadows behind the L building of the Commodore living facility, and felt the heaviness of the pipe as it struck her head from behind. Her skull split open then, she was sure of it. She was in agony, her soul ravaged by unimaginable pain, and could still feel them upon her. The rough stone stripped the skin from her back, tore away her sanity, and she was tossed upon a filthy mattress in some dark shed to be nothing but fodder. She could feel their hands crawling over her like roaches, feel her shirt being ripped into shreds to allow her breast to fall out, and feel the touch of a hand tugging at her pants to demand the surrender of its captive. She fought back as best as she could, kicking, punching, biting, all of it useless. She managed to scratch the face of someone, her nail tearing off a chunk of his ear to bring forth a savage scream of pain, and was rewarded with a merciless barrage of blows leaving her dazed and her body limp. They sought to claim their prize, the vile sound of laughter tickling the back of her ear by way of a wet tongue, and she felt the last vestige of her strength ebb away as her pants tore and a hand slipped in to touch her. She lay there, unable to do anything except close her eyes, and reconciled herself to her dark fate. And then, he was there. Jinky. Light poured into the shed, a strange sound issued throughout the room, and she felt the world move around her. His voice pried her from the clutches of despair, and urgency forced her body to know life again, and he offered her the slightest glimmer of hope. He snatched her up, turning her roughly to avoid a vicious stab, and paid for his heroism with a deep slice across his side. His knee slammed into the face of another, the bones splintering beneath the impact, and he screamed for her to run. She forced herself to move, heard a brief scuffle behind her, then found him racing to her side, his hand slipping into hers to lend her his strength, and the two of them tore into the streets. She could hear them following, hear the sound of others joining in pursuit, but she didn't turn around. A few minutes later, they slipped into an alley far off the main grid, the outer rim of the stairway just ahead, and pushed forward, his hand nearly dragging her towards the entrance. Suddenly, he stopped, his action so abrupt she crashed into his back, and he shoved her into the wall just before the stairway, his hand sliding to some unseen mark hidden from the norm. The wall gave way, turning abruptly to send them crashing to the ground, and he quickly placed his hand over her mouth to keep her from saying a word. He held her there, his hand covering her mouth in anticipation, and she heard the haggard sound of disgruntled voices and heavy footsteps as they charged into the stairway to follow them. He waited for a moment, allowing the sounds to disperse into the walls ahead of them, and then led her into a musty crawlspace beneath the dank room they'd taken refuge. Slowly they made their way through a winding maze of endless tunnels, twisting this way and that, before finally emerging into the tight chamber they were in now. She could feel a sudden shift in temperature, the coolness of the tunnels dissipating before the boiler's familiar heat, and a tiny sliver of light appeared in the darkness ahead. She made her way towards it, instinctively pushed against the side, and was rewarded with the brightness of a subterranean basement, the lighting nothing more than a lone torch in the dark illuminating the room around them. The massive breach in the wall slid back into place, the action occurring with little more than the sound of a silent click, yet she didn't dare to yield her strength for even a second. She turned, locking her eyes on the door, her heart forcing the blood throughout her body to ensure her ability to move, yet found only a heavy sigh issuing from behind her, his body slumped over in exhaustion, gasping for breath, before finally dropping to the floor altogether, completely spent. His finger made a sweeping turn throughout the room, pointing out the obvious fact her mind refused to settle on, and he nodded knowingly with a weak smile. She blinked, not understanding, then allowed her eyes to accept the truth before her. Red. The word slipped from her mouth in hushed disbelief. It's red. The stone is red. She smiled, her body relenting to the moment and crashing down in a heap, and a soft mixture of laughter and tears escaped her lips. We're in the bricks. Oh, Creator, thank you, we're back in the bricks. She cried, the pent-up emotions suppressed to allow her to forge herself into steel now melted into nothing more than slag to be washed away beneath a river of tears, and he did nothing to stop it. He knew the pain within her, the indignity festering in her heart, and he allowed her to drown her soul, in pity, before acting to stem the tide. We're below the fields, an old storage room, or maybe a bunker, left over from the scorch, but we're home. He forced himself to his feet, his distress clearly displayed without the apparent sign of his hand covering his side, and slowly gathered enough strength to walk over and lower himself beside her. The old man told me about the veins when I was little. They're spread throughout the entire zone if you know where to look, and he put his foot up my ass until I knew every one of them. He pointed towards the wall, the opening now completely hidden, and offered it as an example. This one goes all the way down, all the way to the river Styx if you take the left bend, but the right leads into the sewer. He didn't elaborate, he didn't have to, but she waited patiently, her head lowered and her eyes still filled with tears, for him to admonish her. It never came. We got lucky. This one is pretty close to the stairway, so when we disappeared, the scabs automatically assumed we were making a dash for one of the checkpoints to alert security. He continued. We were probably clear after the first minute, but the vein runs so close to the steps I could hear them just off in the distance, and thought it would be best to just make a run for it. He pushed past the moment, tearing himself from the thought of what it meant if he was wrong, and forced himself from his stupor. Anyway, most people don't know about the veins, unless you're ex-military like the old man, and there's actually a locking pin if you know where to find it, so there's little chance of them following us now. She lifted her head, the beauty of her face marred by cuts and a large black eye, and finally allowed herself to take a breath in gratitude. Her hair was matted to her head, a sure sign of uncontrolled bleeding at some point, but only the thick remnants of the sticky fluid remained to show its path to her face. She could feel his eyes resting squarely on her, hear the thick knot in his throat being forced down to sicken his stomach and bring him close to nausea from the foul taste of his rage, but he held his tongue. She deserved everything he would say to her, everything he could say to her, and was prepared to accept any anger he directed her way without question. Jink. His face wrinkled in visible agitation, as the searing pain radiated from his side, and he shifted uncomfortably before the agony. He fought through it, his eyes catching the look of concern on her face, and wearily forced himself to his feet. He staggered, the possibility of fever or infection crossing his mind, but gathered his bearings enough to help her rise. Come on, there's a closet or some kind of linen room just down the hall. I'm sure there's something we can find to change into there. She didn't respond, choosing to nod her head and allow him to lead the way despite the questions resting on the tip of her tongue, and quietly followed behind him. Moments later, they found the room he was talking about, rummaged through the mass of old clothing, and found something suitable for them. She turned from him, unsure why she had become so self-conscious of her body now after having her exposed breast displayed before him for nearly an hour. but a trembling hand upon her shoulder stopped her short of changing. "Don't get blood on it. Mrs. B is going to be pissed enough as it is. You don't need to throw another piece of coal on the fire," he offered, weakly. "I know a spot we can both use. It's not too far from here, and there's a vein we can take until we're almost there. I'll show you." He forced himself back into the hall, praying with each painful step his body wouldn't yield to the building desire to break and succumb to the savage torment of his injuries, and guided them towards the rising stairwell. He placed his foot upon the bottom step, the effort requiring far more than he believed himself possible, and softly pushed upon a broken shard of brick sticking out from the wall. The stairwell shifted, slid over slightly, and slabs towards the rear parted silently to allow them entry into the darkness. He guided her into the shadows of another hidden vein, the wall ceiling behind them to keep its secrets known only to a trusted few. Adrenaline forced him ahead, his need sustained him, and pride kept him from falling upon his face and collapsing before her. Another wall gave way, this one nearly a mile distant from the last, and they emerged into the poorly lit vastness of a subterranean cavern. He staggered, as though each craggy rock and rolling pebble would be the one to finally force him to his knees, yet continued to press forward, the rising sound of crashing water driving his legs when willpower, alone, no longer could. Her breath caught, the splendor of the waterfall brought into view as they made their way down to reach it, and she suddenly felt privileged before what it actually meant for him to bring her to this place. "It looks intimidating, but it's not," he offered, nearly crumpling over as he crashed onto a boulder with his chest heaving in exertion, and turned to face her. "The cascade is strong, but tolerable, and it's only 5 feet at its deepest point in the corner. No one knows about this place except for me and the old man, not even his Juarez, so you don't have to worry about anyone else." He glanced over his shoulder. "The water is warm. I think it's heated by a geothermal vent or something like that, but it's filled with sodium chloride, chlorophyll, copper, some biological properties, and other helpful mineral deposits." He needed to get in, wanted to strip out of his tattered clothes, and plunge, headfirst, into the pool's heart, but found his upbringing far more durable than his selfish desires. He lowered his head, his physical capability nearly at its limit, and motioned for her to go first. "Go ahead, get in." A shiver racked his body, forcing him to compensate before he toppled over, but he played it off as if it was merely a shrug. "It works better without clothes, I'm just saying, but you don't have to. And the water is a comfortable temperature, maybe 80 degrees, but your body feels like it's on fire when you first get in. I guess it's because the minerals work on contact, penetrating your skin and muscles instantly, and your body feels it right away. It passes in a few seconds, but I felt you should know, so you won't freak out." He kept his eyes towards the way they came, offering her the only privacy he could, and motioned for her to go once again. The old man carved out some steps, and a few places to sit, a while ago. "It's nothing special, but it makes it easier to access. Just let me know when you're ready, okay, and I'll get in on the other side." She didn't answer. How could she? Her heart was still anticipating the tirade garnered from her actions. How could she respond to such kindness? She removed her clothes, wondering why the thought of modesty no longer seemed to trouble her at this moment, and slowly made her way into the pool. His warning struck home instantly, the water no more than midway of her thighs, yet the heat far too intense to be ignored, and she submerged her body to welcome the torment, in totality, instead of tiny increments. Her plan failed miserably, a total immersion more akin to swimming in acid instead of water, and she quickly broke the surface to gasp in utter disbelief. She fought to regain composure. A vindictive thought of being punished crossed her mind as she floundered for a moment, and her heart filled with resentment and threatened to tear from her in a rage. Yet, as suddenly as the fierceness of the heat had risen to consume her soul, it abated. She found herself drenched within a haze of euphoria, her body now free of pain, her strength renewed, and the water now befitting of a glorious bath. She laughed, the silly giggle of a child enamored with learning the world had so much to offer, and threw herself back to splash into the water once more. Her eyes opened, a sudden rush of dread flooding into her as she remembered the pool was filled with salt, but she barely felt more than the slightest pressure against her at all. The water gave way, allowing her to breathe the air again, and she offered herself unto the feeling and floated, peacefully, as her mind drifted away. "Kai, you good?" he asked, unable to hide the pain in his voice even against the waterfall sound. She faltered, her blood nearly freezing as she realized he was still waiting for his chance to enter the pool, and turned towards the cavern wall, away from him, to grant the dignity he made available to her. "Yeah, sorry, Jink, you can come in now." He was nearly blind with fever when she called out to him, his body nothing more than a mass of writhing pain and suffering, yet somehow he forced himself to stand. The crashing of the falls hid the anguish he suffered for removing his clothes, the sickening sound escaping his lips as he stumbled forth upon legs made of gelatin, and the desperate leap, as his strength gave way, was literally all he had left. He fell into the pool, unable to do anything else, and sank beneath the surface. He lay there adrift in purgatory for what seemed like hours, his body teetering between life and death, far closer to the abyss than he ever imagined, before the wonder of the pool snatched him by the throat and dragged him back among the living. His eyes opened, the savage embrace of the water lost with his dwindling memories of pain, and he swam across the bottom to surface on the other side, his body settling on a small bench and leaving only his head above the waters. "Okay, that's a little better," he whispered to himself.